Hey friends, have you ever felt pressured to choose a cause over the Lord? Whether it's today's politically charged culture or even certain theological camps, fitting in can be more attractive than staying faithful to Christ. Our guest today reminds us that we're called to live for Christ and his cause alone. You're listening to Halfway There, episode number 361, Shadia Hrichi and Christ Over Culture. All right, well, hey friends, welcome back to Halfway There. This is the show where we have honest conversations with ordinary Christians about today's Christian experience. We try to get into what it's like to walk with God in the 21st century. We've got a great story for you today. As always, I want to let you know, if you are so inclined to help out the show, there's two ways you can do it. The first way is totally free. Just tell a friend. That's it. Tell somebody at church. Tell somebody at work. Tell a family member, somebody that you know would love the show. That does help us out quite a bit. And then the other thing you can do is go to halfwaytherepodcast.com. There you're going to find show notes. All the links that we mentioned here today will be available to you there. So you can, if you're driving, you're doing dishes, you're cooking, and you're like, what was that website that they said? Just go to halfwaytherepodcast.com. You can get those links there to literally everything. And the other, 340, 60 episodes as well. Every single one is there. And then on that page, there is a Patreon button if you want to help support the show. $5, $10. I appreciate those of you who are able to help out in that way. Some of you a lot more, and I really do appreciate it because every single month it helps us just keep the show running. So I appreciate all of that. Okay, friends, let's dive into our conversation as we do. I'm so excited about this one. Our guest, she is a Bible teacher, an award-winning author, and a speaker who's passionate to see lives transformed through the power of God's word. She's got a master's in biblical and theological studies. I love that as a biblical studies student myself, and a master's in criminal justice. I bet there's a story there. And so that she's also an author of several Bible studies, which I know that we're going to talk about, including looks like it's kind of person-based, right? Rahab, Tamar, Hagar. So we'll hear all about that. Our guest is Shadia Hrichi. Shadia, welcome to Halfway There. Thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me on the show. This is awesome. I appreciate your time.
I am deeply grateful for you just being here and sharing a little bit of your story. Okay, so you have been writing and you're sharing these things and speaking. But I'm sure there's more to you than that. So tell us a little bit more about kind of where you are and where God has you right at the moment.
At the moment, so I am. I live in Northern California, and I just went through sort of a little bit of a housing crisis not that long ago. And so it was kind of interesting because God was stretching my faith while I was writing a Bible study.
Oh, there you go.
Faith. No surprise there, I guess. But right now I am just relishing in God's lavish love and kindness and providing a place for me when I had reached a point where I was starting like, okay, Lord, am I going to be on the street? Of course I wouldn't be on the street. There'd be 100 people taking me in, but it was not looking good.
Yeah.
Rents here are crazy. And so it was quite challenging, but I'm just enjoying my new home, and I rent a little cottage behind a woman's house, and
there you go.
It's very nice, but it was a rough time getting here. I was down to 12 days and didn't know where I was going.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
Yeah.
So having to exercise a little faith there, it sounds like.
You're not kidding. Yeah, it was pretty fierce. I was on my face a lot.
That's good. Well, okay. Well, that's interesting. Those things can really shape us, can't they? They can be times when, you're expecting God, how are you going to come through? And then hopefully he does. So apparently you're able to find a place.
Yeah. I mean, there was just a lot of different prayer needs with it. And God just did a miracle.
Yeah.
Well, he really did.
Hey, That's a good start. That's good. Okay. So you're in Northern California. Are you from there?
Not originally. So I was born in New York, where my parents met, and the kind of the melting pot of the world. Actually, I'm a first generation American. Both of my parents are immigrants, and lived there. as a family, we moved from there. We moved to Las Vegas. We moved to Morocco, where my father was born, back to New York, and then all the way up until I was 30. And then I was married at the time. We ended up moving to California, and I've been there ever since.
Gotcha. Okay. So growing up in New York, so you said your dad was from Morocco. Was your mom, where was she
Mhm.
from?
Latvia, so the other
Latvia. Oh,
hemisphere.
wow.
Yeah, pretty wild, huh?
What was
Only in
that
New
like?
York. Um, well, as a kid, living in Morocco was, I think I was very fortunate because of the age. We lived there for 1 year and I was 11 years old. So I think as a girl, not yet a woman, in an Arab country, I didn't experience some of the challenges that my mom experienced.
Oh,
So as a
sure.
child, for me, it was really more just kind of the language barrier. But I had a lot of cousins, and play is play, so we figured it out. But yeah, a lot of interesting things. Yeah.
That's that's a kind of an interesting combination. I've never heard
I'm
before. Was it
not
culturally,
sure
was
how
it
many.
interesting to you? Like I bet your food was amazing.
The food was amazing. Yeah, I think my father, I think, kind of got us used to some of the things. Even we were probably like 2 years old, like loving olives. I'm still an olive, like I have to
Oh
have my
yeah.
olives. Like I'll run out of milk before I run out of olives in the refrigerator. No lie. Yeah, food is awesome. You know, lots of they like lots of sweeter things people don't realize. Like raisins and dates and almonds and that kind of stuff will be in the regular dishes. So very, very, very just savory foods. Yeah, yummy stuff.
Interesting. Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
So did the two cultures mesh well, or how did that show up for you?
That's an interesting question. That is one I've never been asked before. I think they, as far as like my parents' relationship, or like growing up,
Yeah.
um, you know, they both, I think, were appreciating the American culture. So
Oh.
I think as kids, we didn't get a whole lot of exposure. Like, I would hear them each speaking their own language if they were, example, talking to relatives on the phone or something like that. But my mom wanted to teach us Latvian, but my father didn't want us to learn Latvian because he didn't know Latvian and he was busy working. So he wasn't home to teach us either Arabic or French. So it's like I had the opportunity to learn three languages in addition to English and learn none of them.
Oh
so
wow.
so that's
Okay.
kind of looking back like a little disappointing, but they had their struggles. They had their struggles. They did end up divorced when I was 13, sadly, but um,
Yeah.
they they did their best,
Yeah. Okay. Well,
and they didn't know the Lord. We didn't. I didn't know the Lord until much later in life.
yeah. Okay. Well, that's part of what I want to know, but I was curious about the cultural aspect of that because it's very like I said, unique, but it's always there's things that you end up taking from your family cultures, right? That you maybe don't know that didn't know how important they were at the time.
Mm,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, so interesting. So then, so you said it wasn't a Christian family. So growing up, not in a Christian kind of context at all, which again I think is very fascinating. I talk to a lot of people who grew up in the Bible Belt, right? Which is awesome. I love that story too, right? But very
Yeah.
different. So that's interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so what was did you have any religious upbringing at all, or any kind of like any
That's what's so
connection?
you yeah, you looking back, is I would say I was a complete blank slate. Neither of my parents expressed any religious um interest. Neither of them talked about God. It wasn't actually until I became a Christian at the age of 30 and started having conversations with my mom. Um, and my father had passed at that point, and that I had even realized she even believed in God.
Oh wow.
So, so it's like I'm like, I'm 30 years old. I'm just hearing this now that because we were having these, she wasn't yet a believer, but she was like, yeah, I believe in God. And I'm like, really? Like,
Oh,
you've
interesting.
never talked about him in my entire life, so yeah,
That's
so there
it.
wasn't that relationship.
What is Latvia? Is Latvia like Eastern Orthodox or something, or is it like
The
a
Lutheran
okay?
primarily, but not 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 many would practice,
Yeah.
or even go to church. So apparently, in my mom's background, from what I was told, I guess her father, I think what she would say to me, Grandpa just said it was too far of a trek. Like, we don't have to go to church. Like, we're just not going. So it just wasn't part of their life.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, and for my father, they, the he also just he I never got to talk to him about religion, because he passed before I became a Christian, and we just never had those conversations.
Yeah.
So all I know is that, he if he whatever he believed, it would have been based on um, the Arab, the
Sure.
Muslim background.
Yeah.
But I don't think he had any of that either.
Yeah.
Obviously, he didn't have a relationship with the Lord, which is hard to process. But
Sure.
yeah, strange.
Oh, fascinating. Okay. Well, yeah, that's the kind of stuff I love to ponder a little bit about, your mom's kind of quiet, apparently some kind of at least awareness of God, right? And how that might have influenced you. So,
And then, oh, you know what? I could throw something else in the mix. And then after my parents divorced, my mom remarried a Jewish man. So
oh,
we have Muslim, Lutheran, Jewish, but he also, I'm actually still praying for him. He uh, says he believes in God, but again,
yeah,
no practice, no faith, nothing, no religion.
yeah, interesting.
Yeah, strange.
All you need in there was like to go to Catholic school, and you would have like run the whole gambit.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Well, my former husband was raised Catholic, so
Oh,
so
there you
there was
go. You
that.
got it. Okay,
Oh,
so
and my close friend was Buddhist, so I think we covered
so
everything.
so quite the gambit. Okay, good. So
Yeah.
you said that you came to Christ when you were 30. How did
Mhm.
that happen? What was that story?
Ooh, that's a wild one. So I was married at the time, and we moved from New York, where we both were from, to California for work purposes, and ended up that he was invited to a Bible study, like a home group type thing, and actually said, let's I want to do that. And I'm thinking, like, seriously? It's like it just came out of nowhere. I mean, he even though he was raised Catholic, he didn't really go to church or anything. There was also, we didn't have a good marriage. He was an alcoholic. I was an enabler. There was abuse. It was kind of a mess. But he says he wants to go to this Bible study. So, off we go. And I would say it was the first time in my life that I had ever met a group of people whose faith, at that point, I would have called it religion, because I would not have even hardly known what faith truly meant.
Yeah.
Um, I recognized it was something I had never seen before. I was like, this is, these people really believe this, and it was kind of rocking my world, because, like I just shared, I had been exposed to people of all kinds of religions and never met anyone that had faith in whatever their God was. And so here's a group of people, and I was just kind of intrigued, and being kind of a black and white thinker, I'm an analytical type thinker, I'm thinking, like, well, we both can't be right. Somebody's
Yeah.
either I'm wrong, or there's just somebody's wrong. And so, I'd listen to the thing. And of course, what's looking back is kind of funny. I'm like, oh, I didn't realize we were the project, because everybody else, they were all believers, like, we got a live one.
That is so
So
true, though. That is
yeah,
how it is sometimes. Oh
yeah,
man. All right.
yeah. So it was kind of fun. But I mean, I was, pretty, intrigued, and wanting to listen, and like, still, I, obviously didn't believe at this point, but I remember one time the pastor and his wife, who were the ones leading this home group, had invited us to their home privately. So for the four of us, and of course their heart was to witness and so forth. And again, I'm being that black and white thinker that I am. He had already, at this point, they had already explained what sin was, so I understood what sin meant. And I remember him asking, like kind of like, here's the hinge question, he's like, do you believe you're a sinner? And I'll tell you how I answered. But but before I do, I'll say that I did not answer the way he expected me to answer, because he didn't know what to say after that for a few moments. So it's kind of funny. So he said, "Do you believe you're a sinner?" And I'm like, "Well, yeah." And I think that took him off beat a little bit, because I think the common response is, "Well, I'm not that bad," or, but I'm very black and white. It's not like I was, I'm taking credit for anything. I'm just saying, like, if that's what sin was, I was toast by the age of 14, which is probably the age of most of us fall. But anyway, that's another story. Anyway, so, he says, like, you're a sinner. I'm like, absolutely. I completely understood that. But what I had to wrestle with next is like, is there truly a God? And if there is Jesus who he says he was? And God ended up working through the my former husband, who was an alcoholic, suddenly began to change, and the abuse began to lessen, and things were happening. And I'm like, this must be God. And so at that point on my own journey, I'm reading all the apologetic books, I'm listening to the tapes, all the things, and working through my head part that sort of gets in the way sometimes. And I recognize that, he was who he says he was, and Jesus is Lord. And I wanted him. If this was real, I wanted it. And so I prayed to receive the Lord, and God opened my eyes and he saved me. But what's curious about the whole story to me is that within weeks, my former husband had returned to the same behavior as before. There was no true conversion. It reminds me of the parable where Jesus of the soils, where it's the one springs up and then falls because it has no root or withers, and things actually only got worse. But looking back, I'm amazed that God even used a false conversion to accomplish what he wants to accomplish, because in my life, it still spoke to me, even though it wasn't even real. So I think that's interesting that he could use that in my journey.
It is interesting. I think he can. I mean, obviously, he can do whatever he wants, right? So he can use what he'd like to use. And it sounds like I don't know. I don't know what your assessment of it is. Whether your ex-husband had just maybe tried it on and decided not to, or whatever it is.
Like
but that's part of the journey too, right? So for some people, that's kind of how it goes.
As long as there's still breath, there's still hope. So, I pray he comes to the Lord. But
yeah. So you come to faith, you kind of make this choice. I heard you saying that you kind of wrestled with it intellectually. You're trying to figure out, like, okay, is this right or is this not? And figuring that out. As you start to grow and develop and like learn, what was that like? And were there any experiences? How did you kind of start to begin to absorb what I like to call learning the way of Jesus, right? Learning the way of being a believer. Like what was that season like for you?
So it was very I don't know how obviously I'm stumbling on my words, because I'm sort of being torn in two directions. Like, part of me is thinking, well, getting to know who God is and his love for me was mind-blowing and heart thrilling and opening my eyes to a whole way of looking at the world and life and everything. At the same time, I'm still in the middle of life with a abusive husband, and the challenges there. I don't have maturity in my faith yet to figure out how do you wrestle with that kind of a thing.
Right.
And so it was almost like two things were happening at the same time. My heart is soaring for God, but my life's actually getting harder. So that was I would say the first few months. But I will say that there were these moments where I remember, like, just the very next day after I had prayed to receive the Lord, the very next day I was driving and driving my car, and almost got into an accident because I just noticed a beautiful tree on the side of the road that, of course, I had passed by a million times. And I was suddenly floored with the idea that it was made. I mean, that's how basic my faith was. I was like, you made a tree. I'm like, I'm still actually mad. I watch nature documentaries all the time because I'm just like, wow, look what you made. I'm just gonna forever be amazed at what he can do. And so for the beginning for me was quite literally eye-opening.
Yeah, well, I love that. That's really amazing. So that was like you kind of working in a Christian worldview into your worldview, right? Like going, instead of this stuff being here, it's God made it and gave it to us to use and enjoy.
Absolutely. And like I said, I still find it amazing. I will literally take a walk and I do stop to smell the roses and look at them and so forth. The other thing I remember was not that long after I became a Christian, like, I mean, I don't know if it was weeks or months, but we were in a comic book store because his son from a former marriage was a teenager and he liked comic books. And so we're walking around and it's a store we had taken him to once or twice in the past. So it's not like I'd never seen comic books before. And when I saw the images on books that I had probably seen many times before, it was a visceral pain because the images were like, there were crucifixes and blood and sexual, and these were for kids, magazines. So the covers of the comic books, but they all had like some like a cross in there or a church, or something. I saw the cross often mixed in with all these things, and the evil that it represented, which I had never seen before, truly seen with open eyes, was a I hardly have words. It was quite shocking to me. Shocking.
That's kind of interesting.
To recognize the evil and just a comic book cover at this point, not to mention the world and all the other things.
Yeah, again, just seeing the world differently is what I'm hearing. Very interesting. Okay. Yeah. Well, that's good. So eventually, sounds like that relationship ended, and I don't know what that season was like for you. Was God present for you in that season?
Oh yeah, that was tough. He ended up, he left and filed for divorce not long after. I think it was barely 6 months when I was a new believer that he left. And I met him just before I had turned 18, and he was quite older than I was. He was 8 years older than I was. And so I had actually never lived alone. I went from my mom's house to with him all those years. And so here I am, what am I, 30 years old, and it's the first time I'm living alone. And I think part of me was still a teenager. I think there's aspects of our lives that don't mature, especially when you're in an unhealthy relationship or abusive thing, relationship like that. You get stuck in that. So I was still in some areas not thinking like a mature person. And God certainly had to meet me, there. And I had a lot of fears. I think, again, just not yet recovered from the abuse and so forth. And there were times when, there was one time I remember specifically where I felt like an evil in my bedroom, like an evil, a presence, some kind of like an oppression, and I didn't, again, a baby Christian. I didn't even know a single Bible verse at this point, but I did know the Lord's name, and no one, I don't even know if anyone had ever told me just call out his name, but that's all I did. I was like, Jesus, 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 please, help me, and this feeling, this presence, whatever this was, just, left. But I think, I was vulnerable, and the enemy looks for weaknesses and vulnerable. And it was quite a journey. But the Lord was faithful, and the Lord is faithful.
Well, tell me about kind of some of the ways that you can look back now and see how maybe there were some times where you can go, this is how I learned, like I said, the way of Jesus. This is where I learned what it means to be a follower of Jesus in that whatever few years or however long it is after that.
Part of it was that because I was in California and all of my natural family were on the other side of the country, and not believers, my church family, I learned what church family means, and they became my strength. I learned a lot from them, and I had a lot of support from my church. I remember one time I was struggling with nightmares, and they were recurring. A lot, again, having to do with my former husband. Again, still a lot of healing needing to be done in those early years. And a friend of mine at church, I was telling her this, and she said, well, have you asked God to take the nightmares away? And I said, he can do that? I just, it was just like an area where I didn't know, like I still was learning what sovereignty meant,
Sure, yeah.
Like I understood it in creation, like we talked about, but I didn't realize he could control my mind if I asked him to help. And the moment I asked him to take those nightmares away, they have never since ever returned. But so it's just sometimes it's those baby steps, like, wow, he can do that.
See, I love that. I think that's a really interesting little peek into what it means to grow and learn as a new Christian, right? Especially given your background with not having had that kind of indoctrination that many of us get. Like, oh, that's a thing, right? That's a thing? That's actually kind of cool. I love that. And friends, I've had this experience, by the way, when I tried to, I taught a little Bible study at my house one time, and I was so shocked that people didn't know who Paul was. Right. Because here I was getting a master's degree in divinity. And like, I was like, wait a minute. Oh, okay. Well, let me explain. So I had to back the truck up a little bit. So you don't always have to, or we should be mindful. Let me put it that way. Let's be mindful of people who don't always have all that teaching. Right. Go ahead.
I'll give you a funny story that happened to be almost the flip side. I was literally in seminary my first semester. I'm looking back, thinking back, I hope it was the first semester, because it'd be embarrassing if it was later, but it had to be the first semester. And I walk into, there's a little break room, and there's a few students and professors having kind of a discussion. And I'm just getting myself, I don't know, whatever, water, coffee or something. And I overhear them keep talking about Calvin. And the only Calvin I knew made designer jeans in New York in the 80s. And I'm like, who's Calvin? I mean, so just to give you another,
Yeah,
absolutely. You can even in seminary and still have a lot to learn.
Yeah. I would have thought of Calvin and Hobbes, right? Like that.
Oh, there you go.
Totally different. Although I'm sure one's named for the other. But all right, so that's really great. How did you end up deciding to go to seminary?
Oh, wow, that was a cool story too. So I was at a career crossroads this was now 15 years ago or so. I had been a believer at that point 10 years. So a lot of healing had, taken place. God had walked me through a lot of wounds in my life, not, the divorce, but also an abortion and several things that God really had to take me through. And so a lot of that was behind me. God had done a lot of work in my life. And then in my, quote, regular life, there is no real regular life. It's all with God. But, and from my perspective, I was at a career crossroads, and there was one of the pastors at our church was especially gifted for helping believers figure out, where are they called to serve? How are they gifted, and how are they positioned by God to perhaps serve and, for the kingdom? And so I went to him with, what was going on. I said, I got this potential job opportunity over here. It's down to me and one other person, but it's going to be one of those, 60, 70 hour a week jobs, no life, no nothing, no ministry, that's it, but it's a really good job. I said, I've been doing a little writing and speaking over here, but I'm kind of smart enough to know you can't make a career of that, at least in the first 10 years, um, and uh, and then I said I was doing a little just like project management consulting and stuff like that to bring in income. So I was at a like what do I do? I've got this and this. I can't do everything. Like, should I, take the job and give up everything else? Do I? But I don't want to, because I love this. I like this little write. I had a little blog going very early in my career as an author, speaker, and all that.
Yeah.
And then doing this consulting work, like, oh, should I put my energy in that? At least I have some what do you call it? Flexibility, So he listens to all of this, and he says, I want to pray silently just for a few moments. So he prays silently for a few minutes. And when he finishes, he looks up and he says, well, I only hear one thing from the Lord. And so I want to ask you a question. I'm like, sure, let's have at it. And he says, have you thought about going to seminary? I'm like, Pastor, it's like, I've got my plate is all, I'm juggling all these things, and like we're throwing something else in, but my heart was like stirred up, like I can do that. It's sort of like the same thing with God and the dreams. Like, he can take dreams away. It's like, oh, a woman can go to seminary? Like, just, and I didn't even have a conservative background. I just had a limited background, in church and all of that stuff. And I'm like, sure. Wow, seminary, because I'm a nerd by heart anyway. So it really struck me. And so, just prayed through that. And it was sort of like one of those, it was exactly what I didn't know I wanted. That's what it felt like. Yeah, that's really what it felt like. And so anyway, so I applied the next term and I got in the next year. I never took that. Actually, that job ended up being eliminated anyway. They never hired anybody for it. So for other reasons. And so that's how I ended up going to seminary. It kind of was God's idea. Yeah. And that's the best way, I suppose.
And he was preparing you, right? He had a place. It sounds like he was taking you. I mean, you've written, I see 4 books behind you, right? I know you've written others. So like he was giving you some training that you were going to need, especially to write biblical books, right?
Yes. You know what? As a matter of fact, you reminded me of part of the conversation I had with the pastor on that day. As I was talking, he was asking, like, so tell me more about, what are you writing? What is this speaking stuff going on? And the speaking was more testimonial. I would speak at pregnancy centers because of my past abortion. I was able to speak the redemptive story that God did, which is also another miracle. But in the writing, I was writing sort of, most writers, and like you start with devotionals, articles, things like that. But I found myself, so I was telling the pastor, I said, I feel like I'm pulling back, which of course I didn't recognize at the time was really the Spirit kind of protecting me, like, or causing me to think about, you don't know what you don't know. And so I was telling him, I was like, I feel like I want to study God's word and write, but I don't know what I don't know. And I'm afraid I don't want to mislead anybody. I don't want to, assume things. And, I don't know what I don't know. And so that was, so just to what you're speaking was, God was clearly moving me in that direction. I just needed other people to help me see it.
Right. Right. Yeah. Which is so powerful. I think that's really important. I actually really appreciate that it was Lord leading you there, but that you have that training. Cause I think a lot of Christian authors sometimes don't, and it's okay. Like we all have things to share, but there's something valuable about having the training to study, right?
Yeah, especially if you're going to teach, because it turns out there was a lot that I didn't know, and it's not biblical knowledge. You don't need to go to seminary to know what the Bible says. There's people that can memorize. The enemy has scripture memorized, and so that, and I'm not saying it. The point is like having Bible knowledge doesn't necessarily make you prepared to teach carefully, because I want to teach carefully.
Yeah, which is really important. I love that. Okay, good. So how did you get? Well, I wanted to ask you. So, and maybe it's one of the seasons that we've mentioned, but since you've been a believer, have you had a dark night of the soul or a time when you felt like God was far away?
I have. And as a matter of fact, and I sometimes I mix up which stories I share in which of my Bible studies, because I'm always sharing some personal stories in there. But in one of them, I do share, and I actually use those words like this was a dark night of the soul. Like there's just was no other explanation for it. And it was about a couple of months before I was preparing to, I had been hired to speak for a pregnancy center. It was in New Hampshire. So this was about 10 years ago. And I remember emailing the director who hired me about, 2 months before, or maybe it was maybe 6 weeks before. It wouldn't have been 2 months out. But usually when I start just preparing, like, okay, Lord, what do you want me to share in this message? I usually share my story, but how do you want to develop it and so forth? And this particular message that was coming to my mind was really, it was kind of heavy handed. It felt like, wow, you want me to kind of really, lovingly challenge these people with a hammer. It was kind of a heavy message. And I felt so concerned about it that I emailed the director who hired me, because I figured if she wanted out of the contract, that's how I felt about this message. It wasn't my typical message. And so I told her, I said, this is what I feel God's wanting me to share. And I feel you need to know. And she wrote back 3 words: bring it on. And I'm like, okay. She went on after that, but she went on to explain, like, that is exactly what we need to hear. There are going to be pastors at this event. They need to hear this. It's a challenging conviction from the Lord. And I'm like, okay. So that happens. Then I start preparing this message. And about, I can't remember the timeline, but a few weeks probably before I was supposed to go, is when this dark night of the soul. And the only way I could only describe it as feeling like, so, and only a believer would understand how I'm going to describe this. An unbeliever wouldn't even understand. But as a believer, when God indwells your spirit, you can feel him, right? And in that dark night of the soul, I felt like he had ripped not only his spirit, but my soul literally out of my body. That's what it felt like. I've never experienced anything like that again, and I hope I never do.
Yeah.
But there was just I was like, okay, you're gone. I know you're not gone, but somehow I can't feel you, God. Where did you go? This was not just a low moment. This was a desperate moment. Like, he really felt gone. And I'm struggling through this so much so that I actually went away to a hotel for one night. I was like, I need to, recalibrate, or really listen for the Lord. It was something, and it was just pure silence, darkness, really. And I don't always do this, but in that time, I actually did reach out on social media, like, hey friends, I'm having a really rough time. Would you please, pray for me? And I didn't really share much more than that. And I got a private message from a pastor, not my pastor, but I knew him from another church. And he emailed me a link to a song, of all things, that's called Never Alone. A song I had never heard before by Barlow Girl, like, not even a genre I generally listen to, but it was this song that just was like, I know you're still there. I can't feel you. I can't hear you. I can't sense you, but I know you. And she's just holding on to the truth. And that's what I had to learn to hold. That was that, like, is this my truth or not? Because if I don't, I have to believe what he says and not what I am experiencing. And what he says is, he will never leave you. He will never forsake you. He is there. And so I clung to that, and I listened to that song. I probably could have gone to therapy after this session. It was such a rough season, but I listened to that song probably, I don't know, 40 times in those 2 days, just over and over and over again, because I just needed that reminder. You are there, you are there, you are there. And obviously, of course, I'm reading the Bible, I'm praying, but I had to just trust in who he says he is.
What were you sharing with them?
Oh, I was sharing with them so God, so before I emailed her, I was taking a walk and talking to the Lord about what he wanted me to share in this talk. And um and also just it was sort of like a Sabbath day also. So it wasn't like an intentional work day or anything. I was more just things are going through your minds. And I'm walking along the beach, my favorite place to go to be with the Lord. And I looked out into the ocean, and again, being that nerd kind of person, I'm like, if those were tears, only God could feel this ocean. Like what
Wow.
would, and it was just this odd thing. And so I asked the Lord a question that I didn't even know if I might hear the answer. Sometimes you're hearing from the Lord, and other times you're not quite sure. This was one of those I knew. And I said, God, what would break your heart so much that you could fill this ocean with tears? Like, what would it be? And I started trying to answer the question myself. I was like, surely it must be abortion, because that's what I was going to be speaking on. And God said, no. And I'm like, what? And so now I'm like, okay, so now my brain is going. I mean, I'm alert now. I'm like, okay, what would break? I was like, okay, child sex trafficking. That has to be it. And God said, no. Not that those, of course, these break his heart, so don't misunderstand.
Right. Yep.
But at this point, I'm at a loss, and I'm like, God, what is it? What is it that breaks your heart so much? And he said, my church, my bride. They've lost their first love. They and the word, there were no specific words after that point, but it was this vague, like just his heartache for his bride that has kind of not walked away, but was not where she was supposed to be.
Yeah.
I guess. And so at the pregnancy center, when I delivered this talk, it was just a challenge, because of course God cares about abortion. I mean, there's no level of understatement made there. And sex trafficking, all the evil in the world, he hates it. But we're called to be the light. We're certainly called to care about justice issues.
Yeah.
But we're ultimately called to proclaim the God who is just. Ultimately, because that's how change is going to happen, through his church. We can certainly embrace those causes that we care about, whether he might put somebody's heart abortion, somebody's heart sex trafficking, and only God can do all the things, but he calls us and he gives us those.
Right.
But we're not called to live for a cause. We're called to live for Christ. And if that's not our primary aim as individuals and as a church as a whole, those issues that we care about will not get, there will not be change. He has to be first. We can't put a cause first. And so it was that.
So did you, and then shortly after this, you have this sort of dark night experience. Do you connect those?
I didn't until much later.
Okay.
As a matter of fact, I don't even think I connected them until I wrote the Bible study.
Gotcha.
I mean, you're making me think now. And I am over 50, so in the timeline, I'm like, okay, when did this happen? But yeah, I didn't connect the dark night with that talk until quite some time later.
Yeah. But you do now? Like now you're like,
absolutely.
That's,
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and some of it, sometimes you can think like, was this the enemy? Is this God? And it's like, well, we might not know, but ultimately Satan cannot do anything without God's permission. So even if it's the enemy, it's still God will accomplish something good.
Yeah. So how did you end up? How did that seed time lift, or what happened? How did that finish?
The talk?
No, the Dark Night season.
Oh, yeah. So God just I stayed at that hotel, and so the next day So I had like an afternoon, an overnight, the next morning. I'm still wrestling with it, and then several hours in, there was just this, um, you know, restoration, breakthrough. It wasn't something really specific. It was just kind of a tender
Yeah.
re-entry. I don't know. I mean, that's
Yeah.
how it felt like. But it was like whatever God wanted to accomplish, He accomplished, um, and allowed me again to know that He was there. And I've never experienced that since.
Yeah. Interesting. Interesting.
Yeah.
What did you learn from that? Did you learn anything about yourself, or was there anything that you look back on and go, oh, this is something that, and if not, it's okay. But I'm really
Yeah.
curious.
Um, in a, I mean, I don't want to speak for God in this manner, but because I came away with complete assurance that He
Mhm.
is who He is, He will never leave us. Um, it I have to believe it reinforced. I mean, you know what? Now that you got me thinking here, Eric, I'll be honest. Um, there's a lot of abandonment issues that were in my life prior to that. Parents divorced, husband left,
Sure.
all that stuff. And so, and didn't get to know God until later. And then my father passed. All these things. I think that was what God. That was the um, route that He needed to use for me to reach a place where I would never doubt who
Yeah.
He is again. And I say that only because I'm realizing a connection now between these two, which I've never realized before. One of the things in all my Bible studies, all my messages, all my devotions, and almost everything I communicate, it will, in some element, always goes back to who God
Yeah.
is. And I think that's what He gave me that day.
Yeah.
A rock solid conviction that will not waver by His grace alone, in who He is, and holding on to that no matter what happens in life.
That's so powerful. I think this is why particularly in the New Testament, although it's all over the Old Testament as well, there's so much in there about this is who you are, right? This is who you are, God's people. And the refrain over and over, I will be their God and they will be my people, right? Like God wants that thing, He
Yeah.
wants us to understand Him, and that's the thing that He wants for us. Interesting. Okay. Well, thank you for sharing that. I love
So,
how even those experiences filter into your work, right? Into your writing. Cause everything we do, right, comes into who we are and the things that we produce. Okay. I want to know about, because we're coming up on time, but I want to know about your writing, and particularly, I think the newest one is Rahab. Is that right? So
yes,
tell us a
yes.
little bit about why you were inspired to write this Bible study, and then where people can find it.
Oh, I appreciate that. So, all of my Bible studies kind of center on these characters, as you mentioned in the beginning. I tend to be attracted to the messy stories in the Bible. I love the people that, the stories nobody wants to talk about. Like Tamar and
Right?
Judah, her father, like nobody wants to, you don't hear a Sunday sermon about,
No, that's a nasty one.
that's
You don't want to. Yeah.
it's a rough one. This is no children's bedtime story, Rahab is the newest one in this series. And her story is incredible because until I studied it so deeply. So it takes me about a year and a half to write each study. And I go really deep. That's one of the things my readers seem to appreciate about the studies. And I don't take credit for that. I'm just a nerd. I like it. I like going deep, discovering stuff in God's word. And in Rahab's story, I discovered there is a profoundly theological significance to her story,
Mhm.
in the Bible as a whole. And her being honored for her faith in the New Testament in several key passages is really, really significant. There's parallels in, the prostitute in Revelation, and, like a contrast. But Rahab ultimately represents us. She represents the church. we're the prostitute. We're the ones facing destruction. We're the ones, that we can hear of God and we can turn to him like Rahab did, or turn away like the rest of those in the city did. But she ultimately is a picture of the church, of the redeemed prostitute. I mean, throughout the whole Old Testament, Hosea, in Isaiah, and there is just these so many passages, Ezekiel, where God refers to his people as an adulterous bride, and because that's what we are. But we're redeemed and we're restored and we're taken by him, never to be abandoned again. And I think that's the powerful. So Rahab's story is a reflection of all of that. It's our story. It's her story. It's God's story.
Yeah. Amen. So much good stuff in there. Yeah. And I love that you're writing about these just pivotal and important figures and applying that to us, right? Because we need that. It's very cool. So we want to talk about where people can find you. So
that's right. Yeah.
People can find you at your website and then on Amazon. Tell us a little bit more about that. And I know that you have something that people can get for free as well.
I do. So you can find out more information about Rahab or any of my Bible studies by going to rahabbiblestudy.com, because my name is very hard to say, spell, pronounce, all the things. So just go to rahabbiblestudy.com and you'll find everything.
Beautiful. I love it. Shadia, thanks so much for being here. I appreciate it. Friends, you. As always, you can get all the links at halfwaytherepodcast.com. I really deeply appreciated hearing your story because it's different than a lot of the ones that I hear. So thank you for sharing it with us. Is there anything you want to leave us with?
I would just say, if you ask God to give you a love for his word, he will do it. That was my prayer before he ever called me to seminary. I never saw it all coming, but he answers that prayer. I wanted to just know him more, and he will honor that prayer. So keep asking.
Absolutely. Yes and amen. Shadia, thanks for being here.
You're welcome. This was a joy. Thank you for having me.